Hello, welcome to this Tech Talk. I'm Dan Russell. I'm your host for today. And it is my extreme pleasure to introduce to you Jonathan Lazar, who is a professor in the College of Information Studies, which is also known as the iSchool, remember that term, at the University of Maryland. Now, Jonathan is the recipient of the 2020 ACM SIG Access Award for Outstanding Contributions to Computing and Accessibility. And because conferences are such a big deal in our field, he is also the general chair of, what is it, 2021 Assets Conference? And if you don't know about that, you really should, if you're interested in this topic at all. Now, Jonathan will be giving us his talk today, but he's also a very active author, and he has authored or co-edited or co-authored 13 books, many in this area of computer HCI and accessibility. But he's got an upcoming book, and the title of it is Accessible Technology and the Developing World. So that touches two major themes for us in our interest at Google. This book will be published by Oxford University Press, and I believe it's coming out middle of next year. Is that right, Jonathan?
That is this year actually, 2021.
I'm sorry, 2021.
Yeah, we are now in 2021, so the middle of this year sometime.
That's right. So during the course of his talk, I'll be monitoring the chat window. So if you really have a burning question, just break in, and this is a hangout, so go ahead. But I will summarize and we'll feed questions to Jonathan at the end. So go ahead and put things into chat. So let's begin. Over to you, Jonathan.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here today talking about managing digital accessibility at universities during the COVID-19 pandemic. But before I get started, I first want to give a shout out and a thanks to Dan Russell. So Dan is the host and the person who sponsored this talk today. And Dan has been a longtime partner and collaborator with the University of Maryland and the Human Computer Interaction Lab at the University of Maryland. So Dan has really done fantastic work for a long time. And also Elizabeth Churchill, who I've personally written papers with and done collaborative research with over at least a decade as well. And in fact, the paper that I wrote with Elizabeth about making the field of computing more inclusive in communications of the ACM is my article that's been most downloaded of all the articles in the ACM digital library that I've published. So just a big shout out to Dan and Elizabeth, because both of them have really been long-term supporters of doing collaborations between industry and academia. And so I appreciate that so much. You've got a lot of really cool people at Google. Also, more recently, I've had the opportunity to work with Andrea Wong and with Emily Fritz, who are both very passionate about accessibility. So I just wanted to sort of take a moment to just thank everyone at Google, and especially Dan and Elizabeth, who have been working on these issues and trying to make sure that academia and industry, that we're talking and that we're collaborating for a really long time. And it's been a lot of fun working with both of them for many years. So the structure for my presentation, I want to talk more first about digital accessibility. And I want to talk about digital accessibility at universities specifically, right? What does it mean to have digital accessibility at universities, right? I will tell you about my research methods, and I will tell you the stories of 4 people who I interviewed throughout 2020. I'll then talk about the common challenges that I discovered between all the interviews, and then I'll give overall suggestions about how to manage digital accessibility both during a pandemic and in other times of stress. So let's start out just by making sure that we are all on the same page. What do we mean by digital accessibility? So first of all, we mean that a person with a disability can secure the same information and engage in the same transactions as a person without disability with a substantially equivalent ease of use. Now, that last part's really important, substantially equivalent ease of use. People often forget about that. And they say, well, I made it so someone can interact with my interface. Well, just as you might have someone who uses a wheelchair, who's being forced to go in the back door, and then they have to go up a freight elevator, right? And then they have to wait for someone to unlock a door. And it takes them 10 minutes to get in the door. That's not equivalent access. Similarly, if a task takes someone without a disability 10 seconds and it takes 5 minutes for someone with a disability, that's not equivalent ease of use. And so we want to make sure that we always have that part, substantially equivalent ease of use. And when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about a number of different disabilities. We're talking about people, for instance, with perceptual impairments, people who are blind or low vision, people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We're also talking about people maybe who have motor impairments. So people who have limited use of hands. It could even just be that you have, carpal tunnel problems. And so you can't use a mouse pointer. Or it could be that you have a spinal cord injury, or it could be that you have limited use of speech. But there are a lot of different types of motor impairments. And there are a lot of different types of cognitive or intellectual impairments as well. So people with learning disabilities like dyslexia or dyscalculia, people with Down syndrome, people with autism. There are a lot of different types of disabilities, and accessibility is about making people more productive and adding flexibility, always. Accessibility is really flexibility. You're never taking anything away. You're just making your systems and your interfaces more flexible. It's important to understand that there are two sides of accessibility. So for many people, although not all people who have disabilities, they may use an assistive technology. So probably one of the best known assistive technologies, blind users who use screen readers, such as VoiceOver, Chromebox, JAWS, right? VoiceOver. And the idea is that if you're blind, you can listen to what's on the screen and the back-end coding equivalents using a screen reader, computer synthesized speech output. You also may have an alternate keyboard or an alternate pointing device. The idea is that the user has to have the tools that meet their needs. However, those tools are only useful if you have websites, apps, operating systems that are designed to be flexible. So it doesn't help just to have a screen reader if a website is inaccessible. It doesn't help to have a screen reader if an operating system is inaccessible. And what we want to do is make sure that we design all of our websites, software, operating systems to be flexible enough to work with all the different types of input and output devices that someone with a disability might use. And so to design for accessibility, again, means designing for flexibility so it will work with all these different input or output devices, right? And by the way, sometimes people with disabilities just use standard sort of features built into the OS. So for instance, features that will remember your password, right? Or will automatically fill out forms for you. Now, how do we build our interfaces to be flexible for accessibility? We use a set of technical guidelines for accessibility. And these include guidelines such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are guidelines that specifically discuss how to make websites accessible. And it's important to note that website accessibility, right, with the WCAG, as it's often known, this is the best known set of technical guidelines for accessibility in the world. It's used by countries around the world, right? People are familiar with it. PDF UA is a set of technical guidelines that people are a lot less familiar with, but it's equally important. There are a lot of PDF documents out there, and of course, it is harder to make a PDF document accessible than it is to make an HTML document accessible. It's doable, it takes more time. You use the PDF UA, Universal Accessibility Guidelines. There are also guidelines for EPUB 3, are the set of standards that you use to make an ebook accessible. And EPUB documents are easy to make accessible, just like HTML documents are. But if you say, well, I know the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I know they're really well documented, I'm familiar with them, I know their videos, I know people who know them. There's also a set of guidelines known as WCAG 2 ICT. It's advisory information about how you apply those WCAG concepts to non-web technologies. Because you might say, well, I'm building an operating system. I don't see an operating system accessibility guideline. You can use WCAG 2 ICT, and that will help you understand how you use the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, for non-web technologies. So that's something that really allows you to really port accessibility to any type of technology. Now, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, universities have had well-documented problems with digital accessibility. We know this. There have been a lot of lawsuits, right? There have been a lot of news stories about universities that have had problems with digital accessibility, right? Websites haven't been accessible, course materials haven't been accessible, ebooks don't arrive in accessible format till the end of the semester. There have been a lot of problems, even before the pandemic. Now, if you look at this news story in Inside Higher Ed magazine, it actually talks about how accessibility has been even more problematic during the pandemic. This article talks about students with disabilities, but faculty and staff with disabilities have faced similar challenges. When suddenly everything went to online learning and all the operations of the university went online, suddenly you had students, faculty, and staff, all of whom are facing great challenges as the online courses aren't accessible. The content isn't accessible. They have trouble, registering for classes. Now, before the pandemic, if the website for course registration didn't work, maybe a student with a disability could just go into the registrar's office and say, it doesn't work. Can you please help me register for classes? Those type of accommodations can't be done during the pandemic environment. Everything must be done in an online format and be accessible. Now, there are a few studies over the last year that actually generally surveys, or data collection related to understanding instructors and universities. For instance, Smith and colleagues, they surveyed instructors, and 75% of the college instructors that they surveyed hadn't received any accessibility training, and most had not made their online courses accessible. Cole Gleason and his colleagues analyzed Twitter data and found that for people with disabilities, the transition to remote education was one of the top 3 concerns of users with disabilities. And the Computing Research Association, CRA, also surveyed and found out that they had 23% of instructors said that they surveyed said they're not concerned at all about creating an accessible online environment. They hadn't thought about it. It wasn't something they were planning. To some extent, I'd rather the instructors be concerned because that means they're thinking about it. And universities are filled with different types of technologies. You've got websites. You've got the learning management systems, such as Blackboard and Canvas and Moodle, where you have not only the LMS itself, the interface shell, but also all the course content that faculty put out. You've got the ERP systems used for the enterprise systems, used for reporting grades and finding out what your grades were and registering for courses. You've got course materials, books, electronic books at this point. For many people, simulations, software that does simulations related to certain types of labs. You've got collaborative tools. You've got videos that need to be captioned. You've got live streaming events, There's so many different technologies involved in a university, and they all need to be accessible, especially during a pandemic. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about my methodology. I was planning to do a study where I spent an entire calendar year interviewing people who were in charge of digital accessibility at universities and a comparative state organization. And this was planned before the pandemic. This was actually part of a Google faculty research grant that I received to study management of accessibility. One part of this was interviewing people. Another part relates to digital tools. So I just want to stop for a second and acknowledge Google for funding this project. So thank you, Google. But this study was actually planned before the pandemic. And so the first interviews actually started in January 2020, when, of course, they were face-to-face. Of course, at that time, I had no idea that there would be a pandemic. So the plan for the year was to have interviews with 4 directors of digital accessibility throughout 2020. One at a small-sized university, about 5,000 students. One at a medium-sized university, about 20,000 students. One at a large-sized university, around 40,000 students. And then one director who worked at a state agency and directed digital accessibility. For comparison's sake, maybe there were differences, maybe there were similarities, maybe there were some good ideas. And so this was the plan for the study before the pandemic. Because my interviews continued throughout the year, approximately every 2 months for each individual, this actually gave me a really interesting front seat view at how these organizations were managing digital accessibility during the pandemic. And I'll mention that I will tell you the stories of each one of the people I interviewed and kind of what happened at the beginning, what they were planning in January 2020, and how things actually turned out with the pandemic. Each one has a pseudonym. Obviously, all the universities will remain unnamed, as will the individuals. So I named them Marshall, Denise, Neil, and Janice. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of their stories in 2020, what they were planning at the beginning of the year, and what actually happened and what challenges they faced. My overarching question here is, since digital accessibility is especially important during the pandemic, how do we manage it? How do we manage it? So let's start by talking about Marshall. Marshall was director of digital accessibility at a small-sized university. Now, Marshall was in charge of digital accessibility, but that was only a part of his job, right? Because it's a small university, they didn't have someone who does digital accessibility full-time. He has a team of people who work with him, but they also do accessibility as a small portion of their job. To quote Marshall, "My job is so big, accessibility is just a small portion of it." Now, pre-COVID, one of the things that Marshall was talking about was that recently he and his team had redesigned the university homepage to be more accessible. And in 2020, they were looking forward to rolling out changes to the rest of the site to make it more accessible. So that was their plan at the beginning of 2020. Notice for each screen, I've got sort of plan and what actually happened. Marshall was planning to reduce the number of PDF files on campus. Why? Well, he said, again, PDF files are hard to make accessible, right? And, you know, if anyone has seen before the NC State, the Great PDF Purge, you can look at North Carolina State. Their goal was to reduce as much as possible the use of PDF so that the things that must be in PDF format, you could then focus on making sure all of those were accessible. Another goal Marshall had for 2020 was to educate content editors on accessibility. He said, you know, most of the content editors on campus really weren't familiar with accessibility concepts, and he thought if he could start a training program and reach out to them and train them, and maybe they could train some other people, that was at least one of his goals. Now, Marshall noted that at his university, very few students with visual or hearing impairments were there at that university. They had a few more who have learning disabilities, but that they get almost no feedback and no complaints, right? He said throughout the year, they get no complaints. They don't get feedback from students, faculty. They don't hear anything. And that actually leads to a problem, which he said, generally, everyone on campus said, accessibility, that's great. But no one wants to fund it. Everyone just says, yeah, do it. But they don't hear the complaints. They don't see the urgency of it. And so Marshall said that was really problematic. Now, what actually happened in 2020 for Marshall? So the reality, that was Marshall's plans for 2020. So because Marshall was at a small-sized university, the university multiple times throughout the year said, okay, we're going to open up campus again for in-person learning. Oh, we're going to change and we're not going to open campus. We're going to open up campus for in-person learning. Oh, sorry, nope, cases went up. We're going to stick with online learning. And so Marshall said he was struggling to keep up. He said every time that he felt like things were getting back to normal, he felt like the rug was just pulled out from under him. Marshall talked about how many technology procurements bypassed him and his team. And so software is procured without checking whether or not it was accessible. So software for online testing, for exams, software for tracking the COVID spread on campus and COVID test results, and displaying data to people and giving people information. Software for planned giving, and even a chatbot for admissions, since the admissions office couldn't be open for actual in-person tours. He said all of these were procured without checking whether they were accessible. The original plan at the beginning of the pandemic, Marshall said, was that they were going to have live captioning for campus-wide events. So they were going to have a human captioner for campus-wide events. But for classes, they would actually use the auto captioning in Zoom. Now, that was the plan. Marshall said mid-semester, they actually had to change, and anyone who needed captioning, right, or transcripts, they actually had to switch to human captioning because they said the quality was just not there for the audio, for the auto captioning. Marshall really had plans to roll out a lot of training at his university, but that never happened. He said, we just never had the opportunity to do so. So many things kept coming up. We never got to plan training for people on campus. And Marshall originally had said his goal was to improve PDF accessibility on campus during 2020. But what actually happened, he said, it didn't improve, it actually got worse. Because what happened is that a lot of the offices on campus, when they had to move to virtual operations, just scanned their forms into PDF and they were not accessible. So Marshall thought at the end of 2020, PDF accessibility on campus problems were even worse than before. So that's Marshall's story at the small university. And next, we're going to move on to the medium-sized university, the one that's around 20,000. So 20,000 students, that's considered about a medium-sized university. And the director of IT accessibility at the medium-sized university, we're going to call Denise. And unlike Marshall at the small university, Denise actually has IT accessibility as a full-time job. She is the director of IT accessibility. That's a full-time job. She doesn't have other responsibilities. And so in her role, she's responsible for supervising web accessibility, supervising captioning, and she's involved with procurement, but she doesn't actually control procurement. So her job is to be involved, but again, she can't put a stop to things. And she noted that each campus unit at the medium-sized university actually has an IT accessibility liaison. So she is an easy way to reach out to people on campus, but the liaisons in each campus unit, that's not their primary role. They have a full-time job and you kind of get IT accessibility liaison tacked on the end. Denise noted that her office actually receives frequent complaints and they work with content managers to remediate content. They get tons of complaints. This was before 2020, tons of complaints. They said from faculty, staff, and students. Now, Denise said she thought overall 2019 was a good year for her team because they were able to hire more staff. They were able to have more activities, do more work, and provide a lot more training than before. And Denise said two of her big goals for 2020, it was to have faster turnaround of captioning requests, not just 5 days, but faster, right? And to require that if you have a content management account, so if you are a content creator at the medium-sized university, she believed you should be required to have digital accessibility training. Basically, you shouldn't be allowed to be in charge of content unless you're familiar with the core concepts of digital accessibility. So that was what Denise said at the beginning of 2020. What actually happened? So one of the big concerns that Denise had is that at the beginning of the pandemic in March, some of her team were actually reassigned to other tasks to help with other jobs at the beginning of the pandemic. So really, Denise said, I think we would have done okay, but we had all these people taken off of accessibility work, and that made it really hard. Luckily, a few weeks later, those people were assigned back to her. Now, the focus that Denise described was at her university, her team's focus was going to be on accessible COVID information and COVID videos. So public information related to COVID, that was their number one priority. They wanted to make sure that everything in that category was fully accessible. Now, Denise noted that during the pandemic, and again, I had these interviews throughout the year, so these are summaries of things that they said at different points. But Denise kept noting the problem with emergency basis procurements, where there were technologies that were procured without going through all the normal checks involving accessibility. Denise also described a dramatic increase in the number of requests for captioning, both for captioning videos, for classes and things like that, for videos they want to put online, and also live captioning for events. Denise also described a dramatic increase in the number of complaints. Now remember, Denise said they already received complaints regularly. And Denise actually thought that was a good thing. She said, complaints means that people are engaged and they care about accessibility, which was an interesting point of view. Denise said the one big problem was during the year, there was a slower turnaround time from the captioning vendors, right? So again, her hope for 2020 was originally to speed up the turnaround time on captioning. It actually slowed down from where it was before. And that finding live captioners during the year was actually really hard. She said they often just did not have the capacity, even when they had people at her university ready to hire live captioners and ready to pay for it. They still couldn't find people to do live captioning. So she said that was really a problem. So that kind of tells you the story about Denise at the medium-sized university. So now we're going to move on to Neil at the large size university. Again, the large size university, about 40,000 students overall. So Neil, like Denise at the medium-sized university, Neil is actually a director of IT accessibility, and that is a full-time job. And in his role, Neil's responsible for web accessibility, multimedia accessibility like captioning, accessible learning, and procurement. And so Neil has also a big team, and Neil also has, so Neil has a big team. Neil said there were actually strong policies in place. So there was, at the beginning of 2020, there's already a web accessibility policy in place and a captioning policy. And he said the policies were strong, but the problem is there was no central funding to pay for captioning, right? So you could require, according to policy, that a campus unit would caption video, but you weren't going to pay for it. And if they said we don't have funding for it, that was a problem. So Neil actually had a pretty ambitious, right, set of goals for 2020 when we spoke at the beginning of 2020. Neil wanted to roll out accessible page templates. Neil, that could be used across campus. Neil wanted to create best practices in online learning, best practices in accessibility testing. Neil said he wanted to make it so many people on campus were qualified to test software for accessibility. He wanted to have best practices for social media, best practices for live captioning. And the one that I thought was the most ambitious, he actually wanted to make it so that in the future, when faculty went up for promotion and tenure, when they applied for promotion and tenure, that they had to put in a statement about how accessible their classes were. So Neil had a really ambitious agenda. Neil actually said one interesting problem at the large size university was that he has a pretty big team. And, he said, our team is in good shape, but overall, the campus has actually a really poor infrastructure related disability. So he said, if you look at, for instance, the Disability Student Services Office, which is really common on most, if not all campuses, it usually has a different name on every campus, but the Disability Student Services Office is understaffed, underfunded, doesn't often do a great job. And so what he said is often his office gets the spillover that, there's so many complaints from students, but especially there are a lot of faculty and staff with disabilities who make sure that they tell Neil, if something is not accessible, they let Neil know. And so Neil said often his office gets overwhelmed because there was spillover from other offices who are not properly dealing with digital accessibility. Now, so what happened in reality to Neil at the large size university? So Neil said the good news was at the beginning of the pandemic in March and April, the central administration had added new staff positions for Neil for his team and new funding. But at the time, Neil said that he personally had to step away because he had been asked to be involved with creation of COVID websites. Neil said that their goal for his team at the beginning of the pandemic was focusing just on accessibility of the top 25 most visited websites, right? Neil talked about, again, a dramatic increase in the number of requests for captioning videos and online training, right? So Neil said there was just a lot of demand. One thing that Neil said worked really well is that the provost made small grant awards. And this was during the summer, the provost office put out like a call for proposals for reworking your classes for the online format in fall, right? And so Neil described how this was actually really effective, that, you give the faculty really small grant awards. And what happened was that in the call for proposals for faculty, it actually would say that part of that is you have to make your online courses in the fall accessible. And so Neil described how there's a lot of demand for Neil and his office to instruct about accessibility and a lot of demand for training. And it was almost like that primed the pump, right? It got a lot of people thinking about accessibility and that worked pretty well. Neil, again, talked about the problems with captioning and said, one of the challenges was since there's no centralized budget at the large size university for captioning, a lot of campus units say that, we want to do the AI-based captioning. We want to do the automated captioning. Why? It costs less, right, than the human-based captioning, which is generally more accurate. And Neil described with a little bit of frustration that half of the campus units have an IT accessibility plan in place. And he was really trying to work to get the other half to have IT accessibility plans. He said, but there were two colleges specifically that were giving a lot of pushback on digital accessibility. And he said that was really problematic. So that tells you a little bit of the story of Neil at the large size university. Now, during the year, I'd planned to also do an ongoing set of interviews with a comparative employee at a state government agency. And so during the year, I interviewed Janice. Now, Janice is responsible for managing IT accessibility procurement and accessibility testing at a state agency, not for the whole state government, but just for one state agency specifically. So if you want to think of Janice's role as being equivalent to like a Section 508 coordinator in the federal government, where you have one person in each federal agency who's in charge of accessibility, that would be like the equivalent of Janice's job. Janice had a lot of great quotes. So Janice was really energetic and described herself at the beginning of the year as a one-woman army for accessibility in the state, right? A one-woman army, because she said no one really directs it in the state, and she really wanted to push it forward. Now, Janice had another colorful quote, which is procurement people really don't understand digital accessibility. She said, so I try and educate them and put the fear of God in them. That was her actual wording. Janice didn't understand why the state kept using all these vendors who can't make accessible content. So one of Janice's goals for the year at the beginning of 2020 was to keep doing the work she was doing on accessibility testing, but also to empower others in the state to do so. So she wanted to expand training opportunities for state employees. She basically wanted to be the one-woman army in the state, that if the state wasn't taking a leadership role from her agency, she was going to make that agency take a leadership role and spread out guidelines and training and, train people how to test for accessibility. And so Janice was just really energetic. It was very great. So what actually happened in 2020 for Janice? So Janice described her frustration throughout the year in a number of ways. First of all, she said that when they started putting out the COVID website and maps and data visualizations, they weren't accessible. And she spent a lot of time trying to get the COVID website and the maps and the visualizations to be accessible. Even noting that once you got to be accessible, someone would immediately go change things, add bells and whistles, and it would be non-accessible. And she kept trying to train the people at the state, right, who were in charge of the COVID web content to please make it accessible. Please check it. And what she said is that never happened. She'd always have to keep going back. She'd get complaints. Something wasn't accessible. She'd have to go back and, and kind of yell at them again. Janice also expressed frustrations with the procurements. She said, look, many IT procurements were slipping through, and one RFP, one request for proposals, even went out saying that accessibility was optional. Clearly, for state government, accessibility is never optional. You can't put that in an RFP. But there are all of these procurements that were just slipping through without checking for accessibility, again, using something like an emergency procurement power. Also, right, Janice mentioned, a lot of times when she complains about accessibility, the vendor says, can you do accessibility testing for us? And Janice said, why am I doing? Like, my plate's already full. Why is my team the one doing the accessibility testing? And she wondered, could the state bill the vendor for our time? If we do the testing for the vendor, it's the vendor's job. It's a lot of pressure on me and my staff. Can't we charge the vendor? Janice noted at the beginning of the pandemic that the state required the use of one of two teleconferencing software applications, neither of which was fully accessible. And she kept kind of yelling at the state saying, look, you're saying we can only use these two tools. If you have a disability and you're an employee in the state, you can't use these tools. Or you may not be able to use them due to the limited accessibility features. So finally, at some point during the year, she was able to convince the state to allow other tools that would be more accessible. So that kind of tells you the story of Marshall at the small university, at Denise at the medium-sized university, at Neil at the large-sized university, and Janice at the state government agency. So what are some of the common challenges that they faced, right? You almost started to hear a few of the commonalities between what they were saying, where their challenges were. Now, procurement was clearly one challenge. And I'll mention that I have a whole set of challenges and guidelines in the paper that's coming out of this project. This is just a small subset of them. So procurement was clearly a challenge, as all the people interviewed described being bypassed on technology procurement. And they all described some sense of, the wording was different, but emergency procurement power or fast track procurement power, or something that basically allowed technology procurements to bypass all of your normal controls. And so one of the interviewees actually said, we're going to be reaping the rotten effects of those contracts signed without accessibility for years to come. this person was worried about the fact that there's going to be all this technology for years that there are no accessibility requirements in the contract. Denise actually described humorously one individual at her medium-sized university who said, yeah, accessibility is one of many procurement checks that I'm bypassing today because I need to get my online lab installed right now today. Denise was describing how this person said, I'm not just ignoring you, I'm ignoring the security folks, I'm ignoring the finance folks, I'm just ignoring everyone. So this idea of emergency procurement power is really problematic, right? It led to a number of technologies being procured without proper accessibility. A second common challenge was captioning, right? Clearly, there was a large increase in demand for both videos and also for live events. Campus units were pushing for computer-generated captioning because it's cheaper, even though human captioning is of better quality, but of course is more expensive. One interesting thing was that multiple times I heard how the university was saying, well, look, if we have to limit, right, what we can do, let's focus on the public content. Let's focus on the public websites and the public videos and not focus on things behind an authentication wall. At these universities, they often use a single sign-on for authentication. And so they mentioned that the universities were saying, look, we know that anything public gets scrutinized for accessibility. So let's not worry as much if it's behind a password wall. Let's worry about the public content because that puts us more at legal risk. That was at least their perception. That's not actually correct, but that was their perception. And so oftentimes things behind a password wall would not get the same level of accessibility attention. They all talked about the high demand for professional captioning and that it was really problematic sometimes to find captioning in a timely manner, especially people who could do live captioning, live human captioning. And they mentioned funding for captioning as being a problem as well, that you can say you want captioning done, but you have to provide the funding or at least some mechanisms or plan ahead for this. So captioning was an ongoing challenge for all of them. And another common challenge was PDF accessibility. Now, I should note that my interview script where I started the interviews at the beginning of the year, I didn't even mention PDF accessibility. I didn't ask them. Every single person mentioned it on an ongoing basis throughout the year, even though I had originally not thought to ask that. So Marshall, for instance, described that at the small size university, PDF accessibility had gotten worse, right? That they were hoping to improve it. It actually slipped because so many offices just, they hadn't gotten rid of PDF files. And instead, so many offices just scanned their forms, put it into a PDF file. Now, there were some common strategies that they used to address PDF accessibility. One was they were trying to educate people and reduce the number of PDF files in the organization. So if you can, cut the number of PDF files by about 75%, you cut down the number of files that need to be made accessible. Why? Again, it's easier to make an HTML file accessible. If you're using a PDF to scan a book, it's easier to have an accessible EPUB 3 version. PDF files, compared to other formats, do take longer to make accessible. So try and reduce the number of PDF files used in the organization. Provide training, right? That was a real goal, to train people about how you make PDF files accessible. Not only PDF, but also like Microsoft Word documents, right? How do you make them accessible? So one thing that seemed to have some impact was to train for content creators, to try to train them. And then purchasing software tools for PDF remediation. And there are third-party tools. So I'm not talking about Adobe Acrobat Pro. I'm talking about third-party tools. And some of the universities purchased these third-party tools to help with PDF accessibility because they knew this was such a common problem. So it gives you some of the common challenges. Again, there were more that are available in the paper. So what are my suggestions for managing digital accessibility? So I have a few. First of all, one of the biggest problems was this emergency procurement authority. So there has to be a way to limit or eliminate emergency procurement authority because people were using that to procure all sorts of technologies that are inaccessible, right? And they were bypassing, they weren't letting the IT accessibility people know. So it needs to be limited, and as soon as possible, it needs to be eliminated because this was one of the biggest concerns, right? This emergency procurement authority, which bypassed accessibility controls. Now, online training seemed to be something that worked pretty well. And, for instance, at some of the universities that offer the training, there was an increased demand over the summer and winter as they educated people more and they told other people. So it seems as much as possible, online training about digital accessibility can have a real impact. But you have to plan ahead for certainly what the peak times are, right? Make sure that you provide more training seats in winter and summer. Both the medium and the large size university increased the breadth of classes that they offer and offered new topics. So a third suggestion is provide grants or incentives to faculty and staff, people who are not part of the digital accessibility team, to make them become passionate about accessibility, and kind of like the small university was describing, where they wanted to train the trainer, educate faculty, and then get them passionate about going out and teaching others about accessibility. Small university wasn't able to do it during the year, but the medium and the large size university did, where they provided incentives for faculty to learn about digital accessibility, right? And then educate others, right? So it's a way of kind of spreading the message and letting people know. And again, the fact that they then got more requests for accessibility, more requests to learn more requests, they said, it's kind of like a snowball effect. It worked really well. Now, my fourth suggestion is really interesting, right? To me, I find this one fascinating. None of the places that these people worked at had any plans for how to deal with additional demand for accessibility services. Not a single one. If you think about it, in computing, we often plan for, okay, so we need to have some on-demand computing, some cloud computing available on demand for processing, whatever company you're using. I'm not going to call out names on them, but, we often plan to have excess computing power available on demand. Not a single office here planned for what happens when you have excess accessibility demand. They didn't have backup contractors in place for captioning. They didn't have backup staff or people who they could temporarily hire. They had no plans for when they kept switching back and forth between, at the small school, the virtual and the partially in-person format. There were no plans for how to manage when suddenly you had a higher demand. So I really think this is a very important one, that universities, state agencies, and all organizations need to have a plan. If the demand suddenly surges for accessibility services, what's your response? How do you plan for that? How do you build out to have extra capacity for all of your accessibility services? Do you have consulting firms available? Do you have people who could work overtime? Do you have extra vendors? This was something that no one planned for, and I think that's really important. And the fifth suggestion I have is to have clear policies to ensure, right, effective digital accessibility during an emergency time. What was interesting to me is that, again, no policies were added during the year. So this idea that Marshall had about the rug felt pulled out from underneath them, right? That's because there were no policies in place about what you do in an emergency situation related to accessibility. And by the end of 2020, there were still no policies in place, right? So very easily, someone who has an accessibility team could have their staff taken away to work on other things. Budgetary resources could be cut. So there needs to be a clear policy or policies in place to manage digital accessibility. What are the plans? Not a single one had any specific plans. They were still kind of saying, well, I think for right now, we've got it under control. So it's important to plan ahead for surges. My suggestion number 4, and have clear policies in place, right, for how you manage digital accessibility during a pandemic. So those are some of my suggestions. And you might be sitting there watching this or listening to this and think, well, that sounds really interesting, but hopefully it's 2021. Hopefully by the end of 2021, we will no longer be in the urgent phase of the pandemic. Hopefully 2022, 2023 will be post-pandemic. What can we learn from this? I actually think that there's a lot that you can learn, not only this year for during the pandemic, but also in terms of planning ahead for unexpected surges. Now, what caused all of these changes in 2020? It was the COVID-19 pandemic. But you can imagine many similar unexpected changes in enrollment, surges in enrollment of students, surges in needs of accessibility when things go online. You could imagine this happening in a number of other situations. Think back, for instance, to Hurricane Katrina, when the universities in New Orleans, those students spread out to other universities regionally nearby. You can imagine due to political unrest, right? if you have one country and there's another country nearby, there could be people who suddenly leave that country and go to enroll at the universities in the other country. You know, there's a lot of change and unrest and things that are unsettled right now in our world. You can imagine due to climate change, right? Due to flooding, that people would move around and change where they go to universities. You can imagine due to political unrest. Even think about, right, the EU and the UK, right? So when the UK actually left the European Union, that left a lot of EU students who had been at universities in the UK with funding challenges, right? They couldn't be funded then anymore at certain, universities, for instance, in the UK. So suddenly they might be returning to their home countries or in the EU. So this idea of how you manage digital accessibility, right? When there are changes and surges in demands for accessibility, this isn't just about a pandemic. This is actually about a lot of the issues that we face today in our world. And so hopefully this research is useful to you in the future as you try and manage digital accessibility in an organization. It's so necessary to think about how do we plan ahead? And you see with the interviews that there really hadn't been any new policies put in place, and there hadn't been plans for how you deal with, right, an increase in accessibility demands. So I hope this was useful content for you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I want to encourage all of you to reach out to me. My email address is jlazar, JLAZAR, @umd.edu. Again, I'm a professor at the University of Maryland. A full paper on this topic is to appear it's going to appear in the Universal Access and the Information Society Journal. But if you email me, I can certainly give you a preprint version. And I just want to encourage everyone out there watching, digital accessibility is possible. We can do this. We have to plan it out. We have to think about it, but we can do this. And I want all of you to be part of solving these problems and making the world of digital technology more inclusive and more accessible for faculty, students, and staff at universities, but also for everyone in the world who relies on technology during the pandemic and during other times, right? We all rely on our technologies to be part of society. Please make sure that they are accessible.
On behalf of everybody here at Google, thanks so much for doing this, Jonathan, and reporting back to us and the Faculty Research Award. This was fabulous. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. And again, thank you, Dan, for all your great work over the years on university partnerships. It's been so much fun to collaborate with you and with Elizabeth Churchill and with others at Google. And keep up all the great work. Keep up more collaborations, more partnerships.
Thank you.